Chapters 25 through 27. 2 weeks later, Jack stood on the shady side of the chimney, scrunching up his eyes as he gazed over the tops of the roofs to the cathedral. With an angry lurch, he flung back his arm and launched a fragment of roof tile in the air. It curved high and then skittered down the slope, bouncing off the guttering and disappearing over the edge. He looked up at the sky. It had turned a weird color. Along with the different shades of orange and yellow, dark clouds had built up like angry gray blobs of candy floss hanging over the city. Rays from the sun filtered around the clouds, striking the surrounding buildings. The muggy, oppressive air zapped his energy, the heaviness making it difficult to take a breath. The weather was changing. After weeks of torrid heat, there was going to be one heck of a storm. As if to confirm his thoughts, he heard a distant rumble. A sigh escaped him as he readied himself for the next leap. He shook his legs and rolled his shoulders to loosen the muscles. Then he took a running jump from the shadows, arms outstretched. He landed with his hands grasping the top of a wall and his feet gripping the brickwork. Hauling himself up and over, he came to rest in the shade on the other side, panting slightly. Every day dragged endlessly, waiting for a call at the flat or expecting Beth's spiky head to poke around one of the chimneys. 2 weeks had passed since they'd argued at the hospital. 2 long weeks since he'd seen or spoken to her. He'd hoped spending time with his favorite place would help him forget her for a while, but it wasn't working. Shadow jumping didn't feel the same. He went through the motions, but something was missing. Beth. He missed her more than he thought possible. Things at home had improved, though. Well, they made more sense anyway. He'd seen Dad, and both he and Mom had explained properly that they would be formally separating. Things hadn't been right between them for ages. He recognized that now. Dad had been suffering from stress on and off for years. That explained the mood swings. But at last he asked for and was getting the help he needed from doctors. Everyone needed a fresh start, so Mom and Dad said. Dad had even said sorry for not phoning. He promised he'd never do that again, and Jack believed him. Aberdeen, that's where Dad's new job was. He couldn't live further away if he tried, but he told Jack he'd fly down some weekends and Jack could spend the school holidays with him. And, as Dad joked, they didn't get a lot of sun in Aberdeen, so his photosensitivity shouldn't be too much of a problem. Jack tentatively touched the scab behind his ear and reached into his pocket for his cream. He dabbed some on his face. His skin was slowly getting better, but he wasn't using a new lotion. Seeing Dad again after all these months was like having a hefty weight lifted from his shoulders. Looking back, it did seem as if the more he missed Dad, the worse his fragile skin had got. But it wasn't easy to prove Worry was responsible. He'd probably never know for sure. Even though Dad reckoned he didn't need a new sun cream, he wanted Jack to see the specialist in case there were better treatments available. Jack agreed. Anything for a quiet life. Trouble was, life was too quiet, thought Jack as he rammed the lid on the tube and sat it beside him on the tiles. Enough was enough. Time to mend some bridges. He rooted in his pocket and brought out Mom's phone. Hey, you. Jack raised his head. Tiny pieces of debris bounced down the tiles toward him as Beth appeared a couple of meters away. She wore her usual black leggings and t-shirt and her makeup as startling as ever. Hey, said Jack. She scooted down the slope and sat beside him, taking her rucksack off and placing it between her knees. I'm glad you came, he said. To tell you the truth, I nearly didn't, she mumbled as she toyed with her rucksack. I should have told you about the article, but I admit a bigger part of me didn't want you to stop the search. And you're right, looking for your dad did take my mind off my own problems, and it was fun to start with. Until it all turned serious. Then I couldn't find the words to tell you what I'd read. It's okay, I've got a brain. I didn't need to agree with everything you suggested. He cleared his throat. And I'm sorry, for not telling you about the ashes. Beth edged nearer to Jack, looping the straps of her bag over her knees. Jack grinned. It was great to see her. Great to see her black-lined eyes creased at the corners, and her lips quirked upwards in a tentative smile. So what now? I've got an idea, he said. Want to do some jumping? Beth beamed. I got the feeling you didn't want me up here. He gave an embarrassed laugh. Yeah, well, that was before, everything. I learned some things aren't even better when they're shared. It's not the same without you. He pulled her to her feet. But we haven't got long. It's going to rain. Let's have a race then. Jack raised an eyebrow. She had to be joking. I'll win. Don't be so sure. I've been practicing. He shrugged. He knew the roofs like the back of his scabby hand. No way she was better than him. But he wasn't going to argue. The race finishes there, she said, pointing to a distinctive tall ornate chimney in the distance. You'll have to leave that here, he gestured at the rucksack Beth still had in her hand. We can pick it up on the way back. I don't know, said Beth, clutching it to her chest. It'll be safe here. You can't jump properly with it. He held out his hand, and slowly she handed it to him. He lodged it against the upper side of the chimney where they sat. They lined up on the flat section of the roof as the first drops of rain landed around them. Beth looked at Jack, and he gave her a small smile of encouragement. His insides started to churn with nervous anticipation. "Ready, go," shouted Beth. They sped along the asphalted roof, rounded a corner, and leapt over a low wall. As Jack raced up a steep pitch with Beth, he could already feel himself pulling in front. He reached the top and got a tantalizing view through the fine drizzle of the finish before slithering down the other side and heaving himself over a wall. Jack glanced back to see Beth not far behind. Within a matter of seconds, the rain became torrential. It hammered around him, streaming past and over his feet, towards the guttering. He was soaked. The water seeped into his trainers. Each step he took made them squelch. Above, the sky was dark and heavy, lit occasionally by vivid flashes of lightning. Booms and crashes of thunder followed. Jack looked back. Water streamed down Beth's face and plastered her hair to her scalp. Black rivulets flowed down her cheeks where her eye makeup had dissolved. Her teeth chattered like his own. He spotted a small brick overhang. "We need to get under cover. This way," he shouted, straining to be heard above the pounding rain. Grabbing Beth's arm, he clawed his way up a slope, feet and fingers sliding on the sopping tiles. He knew they were exposed and vulnerable on the roof. The race was all but forgotten. "My bag!" screamed Beth as she twisted round to set off back the way they'd come. "It'll get wet. It's too slippery." Jack tried to grasp her arm once more, but she wrestled it out of reach. He shouted again, but the cascading water drowned out his words. He watched as she vaulted over a wall. He leapt after her. His foot caught on something, and he stumbled onto a puddle of rainwater. He staggered to his knees, but made it no further as something hard slammed into his ribs. The pain was unbearable, as if his lungs had been pulled through his throat. Through blurred eyes, he looked around. Fuzzy shapes appeared, and stripes. His pulse quickened. Deck chairs. He must have leapt onto the roof terrace. A figure loomed over him. Kai. He lurched onto his knees, clutching his side. "You again," sneered Kai. "Where's your freaky girlfriend?" "She's not up here." Jack took a breath and winced as a sharp ache pierced his ribs. "See, I don't believe you. You need to learn to stay away from here." As Jack struggled to get up, Beth appeared. She crept up behind Kai. Time seemed to stand still as Jack watched her maneuver the rucksack off her back. Holding both straps in both hands, she swung it at once and brought it up to hit Kai over on his oversized head. His legs buckled under him and he fell. It was like watching a demolition of an industrial chimney. "Who's gonna make us?" she said. She held out a hand and helped Jack to his feet. Wasting no time, they hurtled down the next slope, putting distance between them and Kai. Cascades of water flowed around them. They vaulted over metal railings and landed on a gently sloping roof. Jack prayed that the tiles wouldn't be so slippery they'd slide straight off the edge. He looked back. A dark shape followed, getting closer. Kai. He ran faster, dragging Beth along behind him. A deep pain pierced his chest as he struggled to get enough breath in his lungs. Just in time, he spotted the end of the roof looming. A low parapet marked the edge. Jack teetered on the brink, almost losing his balance, before steadying himself and stepping away from the drop. He squinted into the gloom. The chimney was not far. "We've got to jump." "I can't." Her breath came in juddering gasps. Her arms shook under his hand. Snot dribbled out of her nose. "We're nearly there. You can do this, Beth. Trust me." Kai appeared on the ridge. She held out her wet hand, and he gave it a brief squeeze. They took a few paces and jumped together. Chapter 26. Every taut muscle in his body sang out with the thrill of the leap. Adrenaline pulsed through his blood. The soles of his feet felt as if they'd explode from the pressure of the landing, which was a perfect one, despite the rain. The chimney marking the finish stood above him, one short sprint away. "We've done it," he shouted to Beth, wiping his soaked fringe out of his eyes. She wasn't standing next to him. Fear seemed to squeeze the air out of his body. He scampered to the edge and peered over into the murkiness, panic and raindrops spoiling his vision. Bending down, he saw the white fingers clutching the gutter. He clasped the hand and pulled. "My bag." Beth's breath came in juddering gasps as he heaved her upwards. It was then Jack noticed the rucksack straps clenched in her other hand, her arm stretched taut by the weight down by her side. "I can't hold on to it." "Let it go," he shouted. "It's too heavy." "No." "Don't be stupid. Do you want to die?" In that split second, he realized she'd rather fall than let go. He fumbled with the sodden rucksack and prized it from her hand. He chunked it onto the slates behind him. Then he tugged Beth up the roof, inch by inch, until she lay like a damp rag, eyes half closed, makeup all but washed away. He flopped onto his back, his chest heaving with exhaustion. "The ashes," Beth said suddenly. As she sat up, a wild look in her eyes, Jack's heart gave a sickening thud. The bag lay there where he'd thrown it. It gaped open. The wooden boxes were a meter away. They rested on their sides, lids ajar, clasps bashed and broken. All that remained of the contents were soppy gray streaks flowing down the tiles. Beth crawled over on her hands and knees. No, she sobbed, kneeling in the muddy rivulet as she attempted to scoop the spillage up. Stop, it's no use, they're gone. He couldn't bear to see her scrabbling about in the dirt. He felt terrible. It was his fault. I'm sorry. Beth sat back on her heels and raised her face to the sky, eyes closed. Jack didn't know what to do. What was there to say? He'd lost her parents' ashes, the most important thing in her life, gone. She uttered a huge, trembling moan, then fell silent. Jack sat miserably next to her. As she turned to him, let's finish the race. Really? He asked, his voice quivering. Are you sure? She nodded. He looped his arm around her waist. We'll do it together then, he said. Half carrying her, he set off up the roof towards the chimney, not stopping until he could touch the wet brickwork. Then he carefully propped her against the stack and sat next to her, holding her hand. Neither of them spoke. Kai had disappeared. Jack was sure he hadn't seen the last of him, but it didn't matter anymore. They were safe for now, and that was enough. For the first time, he noticed the rain had stopped, the clouds having rolled away on a cool breeze. End of the day sunlight reflected off the saturated tiles surrounding where they sat, and a hazy rainbow appeared over the cathedral tower. Water trickled and dribbled into the gutters around them. The distant whoosh of traffic splashing through the rain puddles drifted up to them from the road. Sorry about the ashes, he said. If I'd known they'd spill. What, you'd have rescued them instead of me? Beth gazed at him. You did the right thing. I thought I was a goner there. Thanks for saving me. Just repaying the favor, he grinned, relief making him giddy. I've been thinking. Beth brought her knees up to her chest and wrapped her arms around them. There's something I need to do. Will you help me? Jack nodded. It was not the time for words. Instead, he put her arm across her shoulders and hugged her. Chapter 27. Jack stood on the edge of the grassy cliff looking out to the sea. The sky was a bright blue, small, fluffy cotton wool clouds floated past, and far off swish of the waves was interrupted by the screaming seagulls circling above. Below him, the gray, shiny rocks gave way to the golden sands of Whitcomb Beach. The sun pounded onto his covered scalp. For a moment, a twinge of fear took hold, and then he relaxed. It would take him a while to learn not to panic the second he stepped into the sun. He couldn't believe how quickly his skin had improved in the last few weeks. Even his leg was better. A pale pink scar ran down his shin, but that would soon disappear. He'd never be able to spend much time in the sun, and he'd still have to wear lotion when outside. But hey, there were worse things in life. He thought back to a few weeks ago, a shadow jumping and meeting Beth up on the roofs. How much had changed for him since then? He looked at the girl standing next to him. Beth had also changed. Gone was the thick black and white makeup. Without it, her face looked softer somehow. One day, he'd tell her that. They'd always be different to other kids. Most kids hadn't been through what they'd been through. They hadn't lost their parents or had to put up with a devastating skin condition. But he was stronger now, and he was sure Beth felt the same way too. School would be starting next week, and for once Dread didn't feel his every waking moment. Ready? He asked. Beth nodded and reached into her rucksack. One by one, she pulled out the battered urns. Jack held one of them so that Beth could open the lid of the other. As she tipped the box upside down, instead of ashes, a shower of petals drifted out, whizzed upwards onto an eddy of wind. They floated over the cliff on the breeze. The pink rose, her mother's favorite flower. The flower her dad had picked from the garden on the day of the picnic at the beach. As she opened the other box, she shook the petals out. She sighed. I reckon my mom and dad would have been glad you chose to save me rather than their remains, and they'll always be with me, in here. She tapped her chest with a finger. What's this, by the way? She stopped and dug around in the bag, pulling out a glass paperweight he'd put in her rucksack at Auntie Lil's. Ah, he said, I can explain. No need. I can guess. In the distance, a dusty cloud moved along the road towards them. Bus is coming, said Jack. Race you, said Beth as she sprinted towards the bus. Stop, her black hair bobbing in the breeze. Oi, that's not fair. Jack grinned as he tore after her. Some things would never change.